The Canadian prairies and the American Great Plains are the same land, the same flat sky, the same dry wind, the same brutal winters, and the same summers that can turn from green to brown in a week. In the 1930s, the same disaster hit both sides of the border. The same drought, the same dust storms, the same collapsing wheat prices, the same banks calling in loans. In Canada's Saskatchewan province alone, 250,000 people left the prairies between 1931 and 1941. 14,000 farms were abandoned in 1936 alone. The Canadian prairie suffered, but it came back differently than the American plains did. Because what happened after the disaster was different. What Canada built, in the wreckage of the 1930s and in the decades that followed, was a set of farming practices, institutions, and habits of mind that made their prairie more resilient than almost anything on the American side of the border. American farmers saw what Canada was doing. Some of them listened. Most of them didn't. These are 5 lessons that Canadian prairie farmers learned the hard way, and that American agriculture largely refused to hear. They planted trees. The Indian Head Shelter Belt, Saskatchewan, 1901, present. In 1901, 3 decades before the Dust Bowl, the Canadian government opened the Indian Head Tree Nursery in Saskatchewan. Its purpose was simple: give prairie farmers free trees. Not to be generous, to survive. The prairie wind was the enemy. It dried the soil. It blew away the topsoil. It turned a drought from a bad year into a catastrophe. Trees planted in rows across a field, shelter belts, could slow the wind, trap snow for moisture, reduce evaporation, hold the soil in place. For decades, the Indian Head Nursery distributed seedlings free of charge to any prairie farmer who would plant them. When the Dust Bowl hit in the 1930s, the farms with shelter belts fared measurably better than the ones without. The lesson was written in the soil itself. On the American side of the border, farmers had shelter belts too. The government planted them during the New Deal. But in the 1970s, when the push to get big came, American farmers began ripping them out. They needed the extra acres. They needed the big fields that the big equipment required. The trees came down. The wind had nothing to stop it. Canada kept its shelter belts. No-till farming became the standard on the Canadian prairies. The soil stayed. The moisture stayed. When drought returned, as it always does on the prairie, the farms with the trees standing had something to hold on to. The ones without them had already forgotten why they were planted. They farmed in strips. Strip farming / summer fallow. Canadian prairies, 1930s, present. A Saskatchewan farmer named Walter Motherwell had been watching his soil blow since the 1890s. He noticed something. The farms that lost the most soil in a windstorm were the ones with large, unbroken fields of bare earth. The farms that held up best had crop residue covering the soil, or fallow strips alternating with planted strips, oriented sideways to the wind. The planted strips caught the blowing soil from the fallow strips beside them. The fallow strips conserved moisture for the year they would be planted. Motherwell became Saskatchewan's first Minister of Agriculture and spent his career pushing strip farming across the Canadian prairies. The practice was documented. The results were measurable. The logic was airtight. American soil scientists knew about it. Some American farmers adopted it. But the push toward larger, more efficient, machinery-optimized field sizes worked against everything strip farming required. Strip farming meant smaller fields. Smaller fields meant more turning. More turning meant slower harvest. Slower harvest meant less profit. American agriculture in the 1970s and 80s was not designed for the kind of patience that strip farming required. Canada kept the strips. When the prairie dried out again in the 1980s, the same decade American family farms were collapsing. Saskatchewan's strip-farmed fields held their soil, while Kansas and Oklahoma watched theirs blow. They sold together. The Canadian Wheat Board, 1935. In 1935, Canada did something American farm advocates had been demanding for years and never managed to get. They created the Canadian Wheat Board, a centralized marketing organization that gave prairie wheat and barley farmers something they had never had before: negotiating power. Instead of each farmer selling his grain to whichever private company showed up at the elevator with a price that company set on its own terms, while the farmer stood there with his harvest and no other options, the Wheat Board pooled all the grain together. and negotiated as one seller. One voice representing tens of thousands of farmers. It didn't make them rich overnight, but it gave them a floor, a base price that covered the cost of growing the crop, a marketing system that wasn't built to extract every possible advantage from the individual farmer's vulnerability. At harvest time, in America, similar proposals were called socialism. Farmers who pushed for collective marketing were accused of working against the free market. The grain companies spent heavily to make sure cooperative marketing never became what it became in Canada. Canadian prairie farmers sold together for 70 years. Under the wheat board system, American farmers sold alone against grain companies that had every structural advantage that comes with size. The gap in outcomes was not a coincidence. They built machines that fit the land. Massey Ferguson and Canadian Prairie Engineering. 1940s-1980s. Massey Ferguson is not an American company. It was born in Canada. Massey Manufacturing, founded in Ontario in 1847, built farm equipment for the Canadian prairie. From the beginning, when it merged with the British firm Ferguson, in 1953, it became one of the most powerful agricultural equipment companies in the world. The engineers at Massey Ferguson were not designing tractors for ideal conditions. They were designing for the Canadian prairie. 4 late springs, short growing seasons, heavy clay soils, sudden storms, and a margin for error measured in days. Their equipment was built for the reality of farming at the edge of what was survivable. The most powerful tractors they produced were not monuments to speed or size for its own sake. They were tools designed around the land's demands. Tractors working on a prairie farm, whether in Canada or the UK, where Ferguson's engineering legacy was also felt, were optimized for precision and durability over raw horsepower. The American equipment industry in the 1970s went the opposite direction. Bigger, faster, more acres per hour. The John Deeres and International harvesters of that era were designed for the farmer who had borrowed big and needed to cover maximum ground. They helped a farmer plant more. They also helped him go broke faster. When the prices fell, the Canadian approach, built on equipment suited to what the land could actually sustain, was a philosophy as much as an engineering decision. They kept the community alive. Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Administration, 1935 to 2012. In 1935, the worst year of the Canadian prairie drought, the federal government created an agency called the Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Administration, the PFRA. Its mandate was not to hand out money. Its mandate was to rebuild farming from the ground up, sustainably, communally, for the long term. It operated community pastures that multiple farm families shared. It built water infrastructure, small reservoirs, wells, irrigation projects that no individual farmer could afford alone. It planted shelter belts. It taught soil conservation. It ran research stations. It connected farmers to each other. For over 70 years, it was the structural backbone of prairie survival. The American Great Plains had nothing like it. America had government programs, some of which, as we've covered in other deep Furrow stories, made things worse rather than better. But a sustained, regional, community-focused agency, built specifically for the long-term health of a farming region. America never built one that lasted. The PFRA was shut down in 2012 by the Canadian federal government, citing budget cuts. Canadian farmers who had relied on it said losing it felt like losing a neighbor who had always been there. One farmer in Saskatchewan looked at the land his grandfather had farmed and thought about what the agency had done over those 77 years. "We're still here," he said. "That doesn't happen by accident." Canada is one of the few countries in the world that has built real wealth from farming, not by having the best land, not by having the best weather. The Canadian prairie weather story is one of extremes that would test the toughest farmer alive, but by choosing, again and again, to treat the land as something that had to be maintained, not just extracted from. Trees planted to hold the wind, strips designed to hold the soil, a board that helped farmers sell together, equipment built for what the land could take, an agency that stayed for 77 years. On the American side of the border, the same lessons were available. Some were adopted. Many were discarded when the economics pointed elsewhere. Today, who owns the most farmland in America is no longer a question that leads you to a farming family. It leads you to investment firms. insurance companies, institutional funds. The land is still there. What changed is who holds it and what they are trying to do with it. The Canadian prairie farmer who watched the dust rise and planted a row of trees anyway knew something that gets forgotten. In every boom cycle, the land is not a deposit. It is not something you make a withdrawal from and leave. It is something you either keep or lose. And losing it takes longer to undo than anyone standing at the edge of the field in a good year ever wants to believe. New stories every week on Deep Furrow.